If you turned on CNN, BBC, or picked up a Reuters wire today, here's a clean version of the story. Iran just buried its supreme leader. A 12-hour funeral procession moved through Tehran today. Mourners carrying the coffins of Ali Khamenei and his family members, martyred back in February in the opening strikes of this war. Foreign dignitaries showed up to pay respects. Millions are expected before the burial. Meanwhile, in the background, US and Iranian negotiators are in Doha, technical teams talking about the Strait of Hormuz, and Vice President Vance is telling reporters things are going well. That's the story. Grief in Tehran, diplomacy in Doha, a ceasefire holding, more or less. But here's the thing nobody's really connecting on air. The single sentence that is going to decide whether this war restarts isn't being said at the funeral, and it isn't being said in the press conferences either. It's sitting inside a legal document that most people have never actually read the text of, and that sentence has an expiration date on it. Let that sink in for a second. A ceasefire in a modern war that comes with a countdown clock nobody's talking about. So today, I want to walk you through what I'm calling the toll trap, why this ceasefire was built to look like peace while actually being built to expire, who benefits when it does, and why I think the next flashpoint isn't going to be a nuclear facility or a missile strike. It's going to be an invoice. Back on June 17th, Trump and Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian signed a memorandum of understanding, an MOU, to end the war. It happened, of all places, at a dinner with French President Macron at Versailles, right after the G7. Very theatrical, very photogenic. Here's the part that matters. According to reporting on the actual text, the memorandum states that Iran will ensure safe passage of commercial vessels with no charge for 60 days only through the Strait of Hormuz. 60 days, not indefinitely, not until further negotiation. 60 days, full stop. Now, does that make sense as a throwaway detail? Because it isn't one. Before the war, roughly a fifth of the entire world's seaborne oil trade moved through that strait. When Iran shut it down back in February, gas prices in the US jumped by more than $1.30 a gallon, and the US had to draw down its strategic oil reserves to levels not seen since 1984. This isn't a regional squabble over a waterway, this is the artery. So when the negotiators wrote 60 days into that document, they weren't buying peace, they were buying time. And Iran knew it. Because within weeks, Iran's parliament was already moving to formally claim jurisdiction over the strait through something they created called the Persian Gulf Strait Authority. The PGSA and lawmakers started talking about charging vessels for passage the moment that 60-day window closes. Push back on me if you want, but I think that clause is basically a landmine with a timer on it, and both sides knew exactly what they were signing. Now look, I'm not going to pretend I have some crystal ball here. But I said back in April, when Iran first floated the idea of a toll system with Oman, that this wasn't going to be a temporary wartime measure, that Tehran was going to try to turn control of Hormuz into something permanent, like Turkey has over the Bosphorus under the Montreal Convention. People told me that was a stretch. Fast forward to now, an Iranian parliamentary official has confirmed the toll system isn't theoretical anymore, it's operational, with vessels reportedly being charged somewhere in the range of $1.50 to $2 million per crossing, overseen by Iran's Supreme National Security Council. That's not a proposal. That's a functioning bureaucracy collecting money from foreign shipping companies in a strait that, under the international law of the sea, is supposed to guarantee free transit passage that no coastal state can suspend. Does that mean I get everything right? But when you see the pattern early, a country building the institutional plumbing for something before it publicly commits to it, that's usually the tell that it's not backing down. Let me walk you through the mechanism because I think this is the actual engine driving the next 60 days. Step 1. Iran signs a ceasefire that includes a free transit window, buying itself breathing room, funeral time for its slain leadership, and space to rearm and reorganize without American bombs falling. Step 2. During that window, Iran builds the legal and institutional scaffolding, the PGSA, the Management Supervision Area, the parliamentary framework, so that the moment the 60 days lapse, tolling isn't a new war act, it's just existing Iranian law being enforced. Step 3. When the window closes, Iran doesn't need to fire a shot to escalate. It just needs to send an invoice. Ships that don't pay get boarded, delayed, or in the worst case, attacked, which is exactly what already happened once when Iran struck vessels for using a new US-backed route near Oman that Iranian forces hadn't authorized. Step 4. The US, which has said publicly and repeatedly it wants Hormuz open and free, now has to decide, enforce that position militarily, and reignite the war. or quietly let a de facto toll regime exist and call it a diplomatic win. Either choice has a cost. That's the trap. Cause, effect, a ceasefire clause becomes an institution. An institution becomes a fait accompli. A fait accompli becomes America's problem to solve on Iran's timeline, not Washington's. Let's talk data for a second, because the numbers here are wild. Before the war, roughly 138 vessels transiting the Strait per day, by UK Maritime Trade Operations Center counts. At the height of the blockade, traffic dropped to almost nothing. As of the most recent count reported just this week, it's back up to around 35 vessels crossing in a 24-hour window. Still a fraction of normal, but climbing. On the money side, Iranian political commentary at one point floated numbers as high as $40 to $100 billion a year in potential toll revenue. More sober analysis, factoring in actual shipping volumes and realistic per-vessel pricing, puts the real number closer to $1 to $2 billion annually, even in an optimistic scenario. That's a massive gap between the propaganda number and the plausible number, and it tells you something. This isn't primarily about the cash. It's about sovereignty, leverage, and precedent. And there's a frozen funds number too. Iran is expecting somewhere around $6 billion, currently held in Qatar, to become usable again as part of this deal, with an initial tranche, reportedly around $3 billion, already discussed for release, specifically for purchasing humanitarian goods rather than being wired as cash. 70 down to 54, then down to 40. That's roughly the trend line of daily Hormuz transits over the worst months of this war, according to shipping trackers, before this week's modest recovery. That's not a random dip. That's an economy being strangled and slowly, carefully being allowed to breathe again on Iran's terms. Now let me give you the strongest version of the argument against everything I just said, because I think it deserves real airtime. The steelman goes like this. Iran is a weakened, battered state right now. Its supreme leader is dead. Its nuclear program has reportedly been destroyed. Its conventional military took massive losses. A country in that position doesn't have the strength to actually enforce a toll regime against the US Navy, the UK, France, Italy, Spain, and the Netherlands, all of whom have committed assets to the region. Under this view, the toll talk is theater for a domestic Iranian audience that just watched its leadership get killed, a face-saving gesture, not a real strategic threat. And legally, experts have pointed out that under UN clause, transit passage rights can't be suspended, and Iran signed but never ratified that convention, undercutting its own legal footing. On top of that, the Strait of Hormuz is nearly 40 kilometers wide at its narrowest. Physically, it's nothing like the Suez Canal, where a narrow, tightly controlled channel makes tolling actually enforceable. You can't checkpoint a waterway that wide against unwilling ships without constant, costly military confrontation. That's a genuinely strong argument. Here's the limitation I see in it though. Iran doesn't need the toll system to be perfectly enforceable against every ship. It needs it to be enforceable against enough ships often enough to keep functioning as leverage. Iran's foreign minister has already said vessels from China, Russia, India, Iraq, and Pakistan will transit freely, meaning Iran isn't trying to toll everyone. It's building a selective system that rewards its geopolitical friends and punishes or pressures the rest. That's not a full blockade. It's something more surgical, and frankly harder for the US to justify going back to war over. Here's a historical pattern I keep coming back to. In 1956, Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal. Britain and France, the old colonial powers, treated that as an intolerable provocation, a choke point they'd controlled for generations suddenly slipping out of their hands. They went to war over it alongside Israel, and it blew up in their faces diplomatically because the rest of the world, including the US at the time, wasn't willing to back a war over a shipping lane once the optics turned into declining empire clings to control. Iran, I think, is making a bet that history rhymes here, that the US public, after a war that's already cost tens of billions of dollars, with the bills still largely unpaid by Congress, doesn't have the appetite to restart a shooting war over invoices for oil tankers. Empires historically overextend, get exhausted by the last war, and then get tested immediately by an adversary probing whether that exhaustion is real. That's the pattern. The question is whether Washington in 2026 is Britain in 1956, or whether it's something else entirely. Everyone's staring at Washington and Tehran. Almost nobody's talking about Oman, and I think that's a mistake. Oman shares physical control of parts of the strait. The main international shipping lane actually runs through Omani waters, not Iranian ones. And Oman has been in direct talks with Iran about a joint toll or service fee framework. Oman's own foreign minister has described this as a voluntary payment structure for navigational safety and emergency services, not a mandatory toll, a much softer, more legally defensible framing than what Iran's parliament is pushing. Why does Oman matter so much here? Because Oman is the mediator, the neighbor, and now potentially a co-owner of whatever governance structure emerges. If Oman signs on to a joint fee system with Iran, that gives Tehran a legal fig leaf it wouldn't have acting alone. Suddenly, it's not Iran illegally tolling international waters. It's two coastal states jointly managing shared navigational infrastructure. That's a much harder thing for the US to bomb its way out of. Oman has every incentive to make this deal work, because as a small Gulf state, its economy and security depend on the strait staying open and calm, not on picking a side in an American-Iranian standoff. So where does this go? Here are 3 specific things I'm watching. 1. Watch what happens right around the 60-day mark on that no-charge clause, which puts us in the general window of mid-August. If Iran quietly extends the free passage period without incident, that tells you the deal is holding and cooler heads are prevailing. If Iran starts formally invoicing vessels the day that window closes, that's the toll trap springing, and it means the next crisis is imminent. 2. Watch the Oman-Iran joint framework talks. If Oman formally co-signs a service fee structure, that means Iran has successfully internationalized its toll claim, and the US will have a much harder diplomatic case for reversing it by force. 3. Watch how Congress handles that unpaid war bill. Reporting has pegged the cost of this war at somewhere around $42 billion, still sitting unfunded. If lawmakers start publicly fighting over funding a resumed conflict, that's a strong signal that America's appetite for round 2 is genuinely low, which only strengthens Iran's hand at the negotiating table. If any one of those 3 breaks the wrong way, I think we're looking at renewed strikes in the strait before the end of summer. If all 3 hold steady, I think this turns into an uneasy, permanent, quasi-legal toll arrangement that nobody loves but everybody tolerates. Look, I'm one guy with a camera and a lot of open browser tabs, not an oracle. Go read the reporting on the MOU text yourself. Look at the shipping traffic data from Marine Traffic and Lloyd's List. Watch what Vance and Rubio say in the coming days versus what Iranian state media says, because right now, those 2 narratives are diverging in ways that matter. Here's the question I want to leave you with. If a modern war doesn't end with a surrender or a treaty, but with a temporary discount code on an invoice, what does winning a war even mean anymore? Let me know what you think in the comments. Push back on me if you think I've got this wrong. I'll see you in the next one.